conoceréis a Cédric, pero por si acaso voy a introducir unas pequeñas notas sobre él, ¿no? Cédric es profesor en la Universidad de Friburgo, en Suiza. Es doctor en Lausana y tuvo la habilitación por l'École pratique d'études en París. Ha sido profesor en Estrasburgo, miembro invitado de investigación en Oxford, Princeton, Harvard, en la Escuela Francesa de Atenas. Epigrafista e historiador, bueno, muy consagrado, a pesar de su no demasiado avanzada edad, diría yo, muy joven para los grandes logros que ha conseguido. Bueno, es, como ya digo, tanto epigrafista como historiador. En la primera vertiente, la epigrafista, pues su obra más conocida es la edición del volumen consagrado a la colonia romana de Filipos, en Macedonia, y bueno, pues estudios asociados a ese volumen, a ese corpus. Y por otro lado, aparte de las labores en Filipos, también tiene una línea de investigación que enlaza con la ponencia que nos va a presentar hoy, que es sobre la vigencia de las instituciones y sistemas democráticos en el periodo helenístico y más allá, en el periodo romano e incluso tardo-antiguo. Bueno, tiene varias publicaciones al respecto, no me voy a detener en todas ellas, pero el reciente volumen coeditado con el SROS, Civic Identity and Civic Participation in Late Antiquity and Early Middle Ages, pues es, digamos, una de las, probablemente el más accesible para todos ustedes y el más consagrado también. Sin más, solamente puedo decir que es un honor tenerle entre nosotros. Somos muy afortunados de tenerlo hoy aquí. Y bueno, pues le cedo la palabra. Mientras tanto, yeah, I have to is this one.
The question is, may I click here or will everything collapse?
Este margen rojo me indicas que estás compartiendo.
Wonderful, thank you. Hola, buenos días. Es un gran placer para mí participar en la jornada de estudio y quiero expresar mi agradecimiento al profesor Antonio Llamazares y a todo el Departamento de Estudios Clásicos de la Universidad del País Vasco por la invitación. I'm sorry, I think that's all I'm really able to say in Spanish, and I apologize for switching for English. It's a great pleasure for me to be here today and to have the opportunity to take part in this conference on the impact of Roman rule on civic communities throughout the late Hellenistic Mediterranean world. And the topic chosen by Antonio Llamazares for this conference is, I think, of primary importance to assess the changes brought by Rome during the first 2 or 3 centuries of its intervention in the Mediterranean world with regard to the political structures of local communities and civic practices. In the period 200 BCE, 100 CE, with the creation of the first provinces in the Western Mediterranean, in Sicily and in Spain, and then in the Greek world, was crucial for Roman expansion outside Italy, as was just said by Antony in his introduction. This period was characterized by the deep and constant involvement of the Roman state apparatus in those territories, which brought wars, violence, and economic exploitation, and which led in the long run to the institutional and ideological transformation of civic communities. Since the 19th century, epigraphic evidence has played a major role for our understanding of the institutional aspects of the integration of local communities into the Roman Empire. from the mid-1st century BCE, and especially with the lex Ursonensis and the various fragments of the Flavian municipal law which were found in this very country. The situation is more complicated as far as the Eastern Mediterranean is concerned, since unlike many local communities in the Western provinces, in particular in Spain and in Africa, Greek cities were never provided with a homogeneous constitutional charter and were not turned into Roman municipia. And as a matter of fact, we only know of 2 of them in the Greek-speaking provinces, I mean municipia, that's namely Stobi in Upper Macedonia and Koila in Thracian Chersonesus. Even if the so-called provincial laws, so the leges provinciales, such as the lex Pompeia in Pontus Bithynia, which is only partly known thanks to references by Pliny, may have included provisions regarding the functioning of some aspects of local institutions, the political structures of Greek cities on the whole was not affected by Roman rule. The difference with the West is due to the fact that for both cultural and practical reasons, Romans saw in the Greek polis the most efficient model to run a local community, and for that reason, they were ready to keep for Greek cities their traditional organization, to grant them a good share of local autonomy, and even to rely on them for the administration of the provinces on a daily basis. Although a constitutional charter was not imposed upon Greek cities by Roman power, the rise of Roman hegemony or sovereignty, especially from the beginning of the Principate, brought many changes in how civic institutions operated. The Augustan period was instrumental in this process. The emergence at the top of the Roman state of an autocratic and authoritarian regime, and its claim that Rome should now have the control over fields Greek cities had been responsible for centuries, led to the overturning of many Hellenistic institutions. Some of these changes are expressed in the epigraphic evidence, or rather are made clear, if I may say, through the silence of inscriptions on some issues. And I'm emphasizing here the importance of epigraphic evidence to assess these changes. Let us take the 2 main fields in which Rome, from the Augustan Principate, intended to exercise sovereignty: military defense and jurisdiction. Whereas there have been references in decrees to the use of local armies by Greek cities until the 40s BCE, with Greek cities taking part in Roman civil wars relying on their own resources, mentions of local military apparatus entirely vanished from inscriptions from the reign of Augustus onwards, with the only exception of some free cities, in particular Rhodes. This is certainly the illustration of the elimination of local armies during that period. Imperial authorities considering now that Rome was the only power entitled to have military forces and to take care of the external and to some extent also internal security of the provinces. Similar changes can be seen in the field of jurisdiction, and this is what's shown by the important book by Julien Fournier published in 2010. Whereas calling in foreign judges was very common to solve litigations between different cities during the Hellenistic period, this institution progressively disappeared from our evidence from the mid-1st century BCE. As in the case of local armies, such a change shows the transition from a multipolar world towards the rule of only one power. This should encourage us to dismiss the usual partitioning between the Hellenistic period and the Imperial period, and to have a closer look at the changes in the epigraphic practice during the period 50 BCE, 50 CE. Other changes due to the rise of Roman rule in the late Hellenistic, early Imperial periods, which are revealed by epigraphic evidence, include, for instance, the granting by Greek cities of the title patron, which obviously has a Roman origin to Roman officials from the mid-2nd century BCE, and this was shown by Claude Eilers in his book on Roman patrons in Greek cities. The gradual disappearance of the institution of the proxeneia, which was superseded by the ongoing globalization of internal relations. This was the topic of William Mack's book. And the creation during the 1st century CE in Greece and Asia Minor of new local offices, which were responsible for 2 areas which were crucial for Roman rule: that is public order, and this holds his local officials named paraphylakes, arenarchai in Greek cities, and the dekaprotoi, which are, of course, crucial for taxation. In this paper, I would like to focus on a specific term and to assess the political, institutional, and ideological implications of its disappearance from the epigraphic evidence during the late 1st century BCE, early 1st century CE, demokratia. As you can guess, it is a critical issue, not only for Greek cities at the time, and the question is to know what happened to Greek democracy under Roman imperial rule, but also in scholarship still today, due to the many preconceptions about what democracy was, or what it was supposed to be in the late Hellenistic period. Addressing the issue of the transformation experienced by the concept of demokratia from the late Hellenistic period onwards is an interesting example to assess the changes brought about by Roman rule in Greek political institutions and Greek political culture, changes which are also mirrored in inscriptions, as we'll see. In order to better contextualize what is at stake with such an inquiry, I will devote, to begin with, a few general words to how the problem has been addressed thus far in scholarship. The common view on this issue has been for a long time, and for many scholars still is, I must admit, that Greek democracy collapsed during the 2nd century BCE because of twofold phenomenon. On the one hand, the increasing influence of the richest citizens who became prominent in civic life during the Hellenistic period through magnificent benefictions and would started monopolizing public offices. So I'm just mentioning among many other studies, two important papers on this issue. So the Patrice Simon's paper talking about the aristocratization size of process from ordinary citizens, from prominent citizens to local magnates, and Heller's paper about Greek society being influenced by the Roman notion concept of ordo. So on the one hand, and on the other hand, the constant support which was given by the Roman Republic and later by Roman imperial power to local aristocrats in Greece and Asia Minor. In the past, this view has been expressed by some of the most influential scholars. For instance, A.H.M. Jones and Deuce Crarks, although their books had a very different purpose. The most radical comment in this respect certainly came from Crarks, as he wanted himself to be named, the Marxist, well-known Marxist historian and famous author of the class struggle in the ancient Greek world, who after having thoroughly compiled all the evidence pointing to the participation of the people in the public life of Greek cities under Roman rule in a very rich appendix, paradoxically and peremptorily declared that all his language apparatus of democracy, quote, was just an empty shell. So kind of anachronistic vestige of democratic apparatus. In many respects, the way the issue has been addressed thus far in scholarship has been very normative, considering that the only possibility for democracy to be implemented in antiquity was to comply with the 5th and 4th century BC Athenian experience. Most of the time, post-classical democracy are judged from what we know of 4th century Athenian demokratia, thanks to a huge number of epigraphic copies of decrees, to the testimony of the Attic orators, and to Aristotle's constitution of the Athenians, which enabled Mogens Hansen to write his masterful book on Athenian democracy in the age of Demosthenes. Against this tendency of scholarship to examine Greek democracies outside and after Athens through the lens of the Athenian model, we should move, I think, from the constitution of the Athenians, in which Aristotle aimed to write a constitutional history of Athens and of only Athens, to the politics, in which Aristotle aimed to write in which Aristotle and his school adopted a broader view and took into consideration the diversity of political experiences throughout the Greek world. In the politics, Aristotle admits there were, quote, different forms of democracy, categories, it's eidos, ide in their Greek original text. And he talks of demokratiae in the plural form. What is more, Aristotle was even ready to recognize as one of these categories of demokratia or demokratiae a regime which would include a certain level of property qualification to access public offices. a definition openly conflicting with the 4th century Athenian conception of demokratia and isonomia. We now turn back to Jones and Crog's assumptions about the disappearance, and Crog's even spoke of destruction of the Greek democracy from the 2nd century BCE onwards, having Aristotle's broader definition of demokratia in mind, we cannot simply consider then the Hellenistic period as the abrupt end of the history of Greek democracy. And this cannot go without examining what civic life looks like in later periods. In particular, for what regards the Roman Imperial period, we can observe that the people were ubiquitous in the public life and in the public discourse in Greek cities. And I just want here to mention a few examples, or to mention the few important, the major points in this regard. First, apart from some exceptions, and unlike the council, there was no general restriction based on socio-economic criteria which would have prevented citizens from taking part in the popular assembly. And the ecclesia, which continued to meet on a regular basis, usually once a month, is constantly mentioned alongside the bullae in the epigraphic evidence of the imperial period, as one of the 2 political bodies responsible for the decision-making process. Second, irrespective of the official role which was acknowledged to the demos within the functioning of the political institutions, the people also had power as a crowd, and is referred to usually as plethos or ochlos in Greek. Simply because they were more numerous than the notables, the people could put pressure on the elites within or outside regular assemblies, and there is plenty of evidence of popular unrest and riots in the Greek cities during the imperial period. Third, civic ideology was deeply embedded in the public life of those cities. References to the demos were constantly used by the elite themselves, in particular when they were offering benefactions to their fellow citizens, as well as in the decrees praising them for their generosity and celebrating at length their civic-minded values. Moreover, public performances such as festivals and rituals put the people on display through the participation of all of the citizens, like a sort of theatrical performance. And this phenomenon was, has rightly been pointed out already for the Hellenistic period by Angelos Chaniotes in her, major contribution I'm quoting here. The question to know whether the regime in Greek cities in the early imperial period can be described as democratic is beyond the scope of this paper. I rather would like to examine what happened to the idea and concept of demokratia during the imperial period. Was it still used? What was the interplay between this concept, which had a long and complex tradition in Greek political culture, and the civic life as it was experienced in Greek cities in the imperial period? In what follows, I will point out several instances on the word of the word demokratia and the epigraphic evidence in the orators' speeches in the Greek-speaking literature from the 1st century BC onwards. And so I will try here to make a short survey of these instances, and then we'll try to think about it and to see what we can learn from this. The first striking thing which needs to be pointed out is that the number of known instances of the word demokratia in the epigraphic evidence dramatically dropped during the 1st century BCE. During the Hellenistic period, democratic terminology had spread all over the Greek world, as most cities followed a similar pattern for their institutions, which imply the participation of the citizens in the ecclesia, the drawing by lots or the election by the people of the official, and the yearly renewal of the council. All these features, even if not as radical as in the 4th century BC Athenian democracy, still form a sort of democratic koine, as it was called by Philippe Gautier, and I think it's very convincing. So that the paper I'm referring to here at the top of the slide. Yet the last examples of the use of demokratia in this sense go back to the mid-1st century BCE. And we know, you see these two instances on the slide. We know examples from Pergamon or Cnidus in the context of the Roman civil wars in the 40s. So the two inscriptions dates of the mid-1st century BCE, and the two cases. In the first cases in Pergamon is a Roman official. The second example is a local notable, and both are thanked and praised by the local community for having restored, quote, the demokratia. Well, there are different expressions which are used. Maybe during the Q&A session, we'll have the opportunity to go back to this. But at least you can find here and see the word demokratia or demokratumene polis. After that, the term almost entirely vanished from the epigraphic evidence during the Imperial period. The few known exceptions all regard free cities, that is, cities which in theory was not subject to Roman provincial administration and were able to use their own laws. Interestingly, one of these few instances can be found in a letter of the Emperor Nero to the city of Rhodes, after the city was deprived from its privileged status as a free city a few years earlier. So this is here Nero speaking, and he's referring to the demokratia of the city, prostentes poleos demokratia. And the word having certainly been previously used by the royal ambassadors themselves, who spoke out for their own land before Nero. So Nero is just using the very word which has been used by the ambassadors who came to see him, to ask for the privileges of the city to be restored and to be given back. Here, demokratia refers to the freedom that the city of Rhodes wanted to be given back by Roman power. This use of demokratia, which is often associated with other words such as eleutheria or autonomia, is perfectly consistent with the general meaning of demokratia during the Hellenistic period. Cities typically understood demokratia as their ability to govern themselves, their independence from the power of the Hellenistic kings. And they were proud to assert themselves as enjoying demokratia. In this context, rather than technically qualifying how the institutions operated by contrast with an oligarchy, for instance, demokratia came in the late Hellenistic period to have a general meaning to refer to any political community relying on a body politic and enjoying self-government. One of the most explicit examples of this conception of demokratia can be found in the bilingual dedication of a statue of Zeus, Jupiter, offered by the Lycian Confederacy on the Capitoline Hill in Rome, to thank the Roman state for the recovery of its independence from Roman rule after 167 BCE. And as you can see in this inscription, demokratia in Greek is translated in the Latin version because the original version obviously was Greek, since the dedication was offered by the Lycian Confederacy. And the Greek concept of demokratia was translated in Latin by libertas, in maiorum libertatem, luci restituti, and in Greek, original text, to koinon commissamenon ten patrion demokratiam. By using this word demokratia in the imperial period, cities like Rhodes were proud to express the contrary to the cities which were directly depending on the Roman provincial administration. They were able to maintain their full autonomy. And I will not speak anymore of independence during the imperial period, even for free cities. We have another instance of later date in Kieran's Stratoniceia, which also was a free city. In this case, however, the expression seems to imply more than simply the freedom. So we have here another notable which is thanked for various benefactions. And on line 6, you have, can you see the arrow on the screen? Yeah. Pros de kai demokratumene zontes. So the people of Stratoniceia are saying of themselves they are living in a demokratumene polis, which is a city which has a democratic constitution. In fact, the institutions of several free cities during the imperial period, like Athens, Rhodes, Cyzicus, as well as Stratoniceia precisely, but apparently not Aphrodisias, interestingly, kept distinctively democratic features, which were absent from most of the other cities which were subject to Roman rule, such as the drawing by lots among all the citizens and the turnover of the members of the council, or the ability of the demos to form and to serve as a court, which is specific to free cities in the Imperial period. This awareness of the continuance until the Imperial period of the democratic specificities of part of the institutions might have encouraged the people of Stratonicaea to depict their city as demokratumene. In the case of Rhodes, the democratic characteristics of its institutions were explicitly emphasized by Dio Chrysostom and by Aelius Aristides, who both used the word demokratia to refer to the Rhodian constitution at that time. So, and this is all the more remarkable that neither did so for any of the other cities they visited, and that the concept of demokratia, as we'll see now in the second points, when used by orators and writers in the 2nd century CE, always refers to experiences of the past and not to the contemporary situation. One of the most constant uses of demokratia in the Greek-speaking literature of the Imperial period is to refer to the regime of classical Athens. This is very frequent, for instance, in Plutarch's biographies, especially for Athenian statesmen. Dio Chrysostom as well, in some of his speeches, you have here one of example, one of his speeches delivered in front of the ecclesia in cities throughout Asia Minor, uses the technical word demokratia when he alludes to historical examples taken from classical Athens. In the context of the classicizing perception of Greek history, which was typical for the authors of the 2nd Sophistic, demokratia is described as a kind of fossilized concept, necessarily associated with the political experience of 5th and 4th century BC Athens. This evocation of Athens as the paradigm for demokratia is especially clear in Pausanias' depiction of Athens' early history. This is here, this passage where Theseus is, according to an Athenian tradition, presented as the inventor of democracy, even before Solon's reforms. Next to the many references to the regime of classical Athens, the same word demokratia is extensively used by Plutarch to describe the Roman state during the Republican period. And you have here one of the many instances in Plutarch's biographies. Admittedly, Greek-speaking authors of the Imperial period, Cassius Dio, for instance, were willing to acknowledge after Polybius that the mixed constitution of the Roman state during the Republican period included some democratic features, because the citizens gathered into political assemblies, the comitia, and the people were allowed to take part in the election of the magistrates. However, when describing the Roman state as a whole, as being a demokratia, Plutarch, of course, does not argue that its constitution was predominantly democratic in the Athenian sense. In this case, demokratia is rather a translation, or better, a transposition into Greek of the Latin expression res publica. The Roman state was said a res publica because it relied on the populus Romanus, which together with the senes was the holder of the sovereignty of the political community formed by the Roman citizens. Since demos was the most appropriate Greek word to translate the notion of populus or publicus, demokratia was then used to refer to the Roman state itself, irrespective of the actual role played by the people institutions. However, Polybius himself, and tellingly, never characterized the Roman constitution as being a demokratia. So Polybius speaks at length of the mixed constitutions, of course, but never characterizes the Roman Republic as being a demokratia itself. The first author to have done so seems to have been the historian Nicolaus of Damascus, a contemporary of Augustus. Apparently, its use of the word demokratia to describe the res publica was made possible by the emergence of the Augustan monarchy. Nicolaus experienced himself as a contemporary of Octavian. The post-res publica was described as a demokratia not because it was felt as a democracy in the Greek sense, but only because in comparison with and in contrast to the new regime, the res publica were retrospectively seen as a period of freedom and libertas, would be the word in Latin. Demokratia should, in this context, then be understood in the meaning this term most commonly had in the late Hellenistic period. That is, a city enjoying its own laws and enjoying freedom. Whereas orators and thinkers like Dio Chrysostom and Plutarch frequently use the word demokratia to describe past political experiences, so classical Athens, the Roman Republic, they would refrain from using it to qualify the institutions and the public life of Greek cities in their own time. Dio, however, was well aware of the constitutional competences of the people in the decision-making process, since himself delivered many speeches on political issues in front of the ecclesia in various cities, as already mentioned. The most vivid depiction of what a meeting of a popular assembly might have looked like in the Imperial period is given by the same Dio in his Euboicus speech, where we may see many different speakers addressing the people, participants in the ecclesia applauding or booing them, the main officials being unable to restore calm in the assembly, and the local elite being put under pressure by the people. And it's a very famous passage, of course, and you would see that some of the main notables of the city, and the city is probably Charistos, okay? Probably the speech is partly fictional, of course, but there are many different details which hints at the city being Charistos in southern Euboea, and you would see the speakers being terrorized by the crowd. Interestingly, as you can see, even if it's a formal assembly of the citizens, so it's within an ecclesia, the word used by Dio to refer to the people is ochlos and plethos, a multitude, just because the people were numerous and were putting pressure onto the elites. Yet, when he refers to the political life in the Greek cities of the time, Dio avoids any characterization of the regime and only uses the more generic words demos. Or, of course, I'm fully aware of the fact that even in the classical period, demos can mean demokratia, so it's kind of variation, and demos can refer, even in speeches of the Attic orators in the 4th century BCE, to the democratic constitution. But it can be kind of coincidence, I think, then the very word demokratia is never used by Dio Chrysostom to refer to the regime of the contemporary cities. When he uses demokratia, it's only to refer to past political experiences. And he uses a more neutral, generic word, which is demos, to refer to the capability and the possibility of the demos, of the people, to play a role in the institutions in the cities of his time. The contrast is even more striking in the case of Plutarch. In his Precepts of Statecraft, so Ta Politica Parangelmata, which was conceived as a kind of handbook of political behavior, compiling advice for the politikoiandres, the politicians, namely the elite of the cities of his time, Plutarch does not even mention the word demokratia. Actually, there are two instances, but which both regard the classical Athenian experience. So it goes back, so it's another example of the use of demokratia to refer to the past, as is the case in the Plutarch's biographies devoted to classical Athenian statesmen. In his handbook, Plutarch speaks at large of the relationship between the elite and the people. He expounds what he thinks is the best way for the elite to keep the cities quiet and to maintain the social and political order, but he does not address the issue of the very nature of the regime. Plutarch's submission of democracy in this handbook, while the same author constantly refers to the classical Athenian demokratia or to the Roman Republic as demokratia in his other works, suggests that he considers democracy not to be an option for Greek cities of his time anymore. For Plutarch, the governance of Greek cities under Roman rule is not a matter of political agency anymore. It's just now a matter of controlling the crowd and of reducing the tension between the elite and the people. Tellingly, the word which is most frequently used by Plutarch in his Precepts of Statecraft to refer to the people is not demos, but oi holoi, though the numerous, as if forming a large number of people was now, in their relationship with, and by contrast to the elite, the main characteristic of the ordinary citizens, who in this terminology, since the people are referred to as a multitude, were depoliticized. But still note that Plutarch avoids the offensive polemical term plethos or orlos. He used a more generic word, which is oipoloi, in contrast to the elite, which of course are just a few of the citizens. Other references to demokratia in the political literature, I'm sorry, during the imperial period, all convey the same image of a regime which was regarded as entirely fictional for the contemporaries. In a short treatise, which was erroneously attributed to Plutarch, and which aimed to determine which kind of regime should be considered the best, the author discusses the potential advantages of the three main canonical categories of political regimes: monarchia, oligarchia, and demokratia. This, however, was pure theory. A philosophical discussion fitting the Platonic tradition disconnected from the political, social, and institutional realities of Greek cities under Roman rule. And in the end of this very short and unachieved treatise, as it should be, the anonymous author would of course give his preference for monarchy, like Plato. This example shows that demokratia could be taken into consideration during the imperial period from a theoretical point of view, but was not considered a regime which could have an actual application for the government of the contemporary cities. In his long treatise on monarchy, Peri Basileias, in which the author intends to teach Trajan to be a good ruler, Dio makes a small concession towards demokratia. He admits that demokratia could, in theory, be a fair regime, but was impossible to implement because of the excess of the people, who by nature were unpredictable and irrational. Therefore, democratic regimes could not have the required stability and would fall apart in the end. So Dio refers to this regime, and he says the following: Melancholy democracy, which is a moderate and inoffensive name. Democracy as such, if the thing were but practicable, and it's not dynaton because of the very nature of the people, which constantly changes. So this view is consistent with the recurrent idea in political philosophy, relying on the preconception of the elite of the people, that demokratia necessarily evolves into a perverted form and tends to become an ochlokratia, a regime ruled by the crowd, ochlos. Next to theory and fiction, demokratia could also be used as a metaphor. In his Roman oration, Aelius Aristides praises Rome for bringing together the Greeks who have been fighting each other for centuries, and for allowing them to live in peace under the benevolent protection of the Roman emperor. In this view, the Roman Empire, due to the integration of the entire world, the oikumene, is depicted as if it were a single city, a polis. So Rome would be the polis, and the local communities scattered in the provinces would be the single demes, those are small communes, like in the organization of the classical city of Athens. Aristides goes even further and pretends that the local elites, due to their active involvement in the self-administration of the local communities and to the fact that they were picked up by governors to form jury courts for provincial jurisdiction, had a share in the government of the empire. And this leads Aristides to the conclusion that this system would be the epitome of democracy, which is very paradoxical, of course, because the imperial regime is everything but democratic. The concept of demokratia in this example is instrumentalized and distorted to, ironically enough, be applied to Roman imperial rule. Obviously, the Roman Empire was not a federal state, and the share of power which was given to local community in reality was unilaterally granted by Rome and could be removed at any time. And this also includes free cities. as shown by an important paper by Fergus Miller in the late 90s. The fact that Aristides could put forward such a radical reinterpretation of demokratia confirms that the concept was not considered any more relevant to describe the political realities of Greek cities at that time. I'm sorry. At the end of this short survey of some of the uses and non-uses of the word demokratia in the political discourse during the Imperial period, it is time in the final part of this paper to examine the reasons which could account for this reluctance to use this term to refer to contemporary realities. In this field, the answer cannot just be because Greek cities were not democracies anymore. It would be too simplistic to produce from the epigraphic data graphs showing the massive drop in the use of the concept of demokratia, let's say from the mid-first century BCE, and to use those data as an evidence to prove that any form of democracy has disappeared in Greek cities from the beginning of the imperial period, and that it would not be relevant for us as historians to use this concept to examine the political life in those communities. Admittedly, the regimes of most Greek cities under Roman Empire rule certainly failed to comply with most of the criteria listed by Aristotle himself for democracies, and even for democracies outside Athens, especially because of the limitations on because of limitations on accessing public offices for ordinary citizens and of the predominant role played by the council, which was now a closed group of lifetime members rather than an assembly of citizens drawn by lots and serving only for 1 year. So this mere fact conflicts with one of the basic requirements for being a democracy for a Greek city. From a technical point of view, however, these regimes, I'm referring to the regimes of Greek cities in the imperial periods, were not oligarchies either, since the power was not reserved for just a few dozen people, as in classical oligarchic regimes, since there were no property qualifications to attend the popular assembly, and since the people were constantly involved in the decision-making process next to the boule, or together with the boule. An oxymoron such as oligarchic republics, if I may say, could perhaps be appropriate for describing the regime of Greek cities during the imperial period. If we look now at the distribution over time of the instances of demokratia, however, it cannot be coincidence that the term vanished from the epigraphic evidence all of a sudden at the end of the 1st century BCE, and the Augustan age must admit a turning point in this regard. Censorship for imperial power, however, must certainly be ruled out. When more than 2 centuries later, Cassius Dio came to depict the establishment of the new regime of the Principate and stage Augustus' 2 most important advisors, Maecenas and Agrippa, having a debate about the best form of government which should be implanted, monarchia or demokratia, and here, of course, Cassius Dio uses for this purpose the vocabulary of the Greek political tradition. The suppression of popular assemblies in local communities was among the advice given to Augustus by Maecenas. But like the entire speech, so Maecenas is here advising that there should not be assembly at all anymore in Greek cities because of the very nature of the people. So the same kind of argument which was used by Dio of Prusa earlier. So all this was apocryphal. None of the proposals which are listed by Maecenas in his speech aiming to restrain the autonomy of local communities was ever implemented by Augustus or even probably conceived by Maecenas. Through Maecenas' speech, Cassius Dio, as a senator, presented his own project for the reform of imperial governance at the beginning of the 3rd century CE towards more centralization. And this can by no means be seen as a proof that in spite of the autocratic and authoritarian nature of the regime of the Principate, this had been Augustus' intention to suppress popular assemblies in Greek cities. So this informs us about the reforms towards more centralization at the Severan court and not about the realities or the intention of Augustus and Maecenas at the end of the 1st century BCE. The impact of the emergence of the principles of the political culture and discourse in Greek cities, however, should not go underestimated. Also, Augustus was celebrated for having restored the Res Publica, and although he praised himself in his Res Gestae for having taken care of the Roman plebs in securing food supply and in staging magnificent shows in Rome, the regime was very suspicious towards any form of popular movement. The avoidance of the democracy discourse in Augustan ideology, but not of the civic discourse, which is something different, was perfectly consistent with the agenda of the elite of Greek cities themselves, who were trying to restrain the influence of democratic factions at the local level. In this struggle, imperial power, like the Roman Senate for the beginning of Rome's interference in the East in the 2nd century BCE, actively backed up local aristocrats who were ready to cope with Roman power, Roman rule, in order to contain or even to crush openly democratic factions. We have many examples of imperial intervention during the first decades of the 1st century CE, including in free cities which were deprived from their liberty in the aftermath of popular unrest, such as Cyzicus and Rhodes, as already mentioned earlier. In this context, the concept of demokratia started to be seen as subversive, and Greek local elites deliberately culled this term, the term demokratia, I mean, from their own vocabulary. Instead, they started using less controversial, more consensual terms to depict the regime of their cities, such as politeia, which was very generic. It could simply mean government or constitution, regardless of the nature of the regime, or patriarnomoi, the ancestral, the traditional laws, which had a conservative flavor. These words deliberately eluded the issue of the nature of the regime. One of the most obvious and very famous illustration of this comes from the dedication which was offered to the Emperor Claudius by the elite of the Lycian Confederacy in Patara on the occasion of the intervention of Roman power to support local aristocrats against the risk of a democratic revolution in the context of civil strife in 43 CE and the transformation of Lycia into a Roman province. In this dedication, the democratic faction were despised, being described as troublemakers, threatening the laws and the constitution, and being denied the quality of demos. So the demos is referred to through the words plethos, and even more, being said thoughtless, the thoughtless multitude. The use of demokratia to describe the restoration of the constitution would have been, from the point of view of the Lycian elite, impossible in this context. First, because the Lycian Confederacy had now been turned into a Roman province, deprived from its libertas, demokratia, as it was still called in the dedication set up on the Capitoline Hill 200 years later, as we saw earlier. Second, because precisely the aristoi, it is a word which is here used in this dedication, the aristoi will receive support from Rome to rule Lycia and to fight against factions which were favorable to the demos. In this context, the anti-democratic rhetoric of Lycian aristocrats exactly fitted the interests of imperial authorities. It is interesting to note, in conclusion, that the euphemistic term politeia, frequently used in the imperial period to refer to the constitution of Greek cities of the time as being the regime of the citizens. This is the meaning of politeia, after all, the regime of the citizen, of the politai. So this term omitted any mention of the predominance of the elites, and this term was precisely the term which was used by Aristotle to describe what he thought would be the best constitution. Namely, a city where the major offices were in the hands of the best of the citizens, the aristoi. So this is one of the many instances. So the expression here is politike, but you would find many other instances in Aristotle politics where politeia refer to the idealized regime Aristotle is describing, is trying to promote. For Aristotle, the aristoi, the best, were primarily defined by reference to their education ethics, of course, but also partly to their wealth. So Aristotle says that the aristos should be educated, of course, but should possess a certain amount of wealth as well. A definition which fits pretty well the realities of the Greek cities in the Imperial period. After all, the members of the caste council have to meet property qualifications to be lifetime member of this kind of assembly. I'm not arguing here that local aristocrats would have consciously implemented Aristotle's projects, even if recent studies by Benjamin Gray have emphasized the Aristotelian background of the political ethics of Greek aristocrats in the late Hellenistic period. But we could say that local aristocrats during the Imperial period were empirically Aristotelian. Or to put it the other way around, that Aristotle anticipated in his politics the evolution of Greek democracies in the post-classical period, and that his project of a politeia was eventually realized somehow under Roman rule. Let us now turn back as a conclusion and for the final, very final words to the preliminary questions which were raised at the beginning of this paper. Through the example of demokratia, I hope to have shown that what can hide behind the disappearance of a single term in the epigraphic evidence in the late Hellenistic early Imperial period, and what implications this may have had for political institutions and political culture. This example, I think, should invite us to pay more attention to the changes in the epigraphic practice and encourage us to explain also the silences of the inscriptions. As epigraphers, of course, our first reflex would be to track down words we are already looking for, but we also to pay attention to what is missing compared to the Hellenistic period. And I'm meaning that regardless of the problems due to the random nature of the transmission of inscription, which is, of course, the constant methodological issue with dealing with inscription. The disappearance of a term in the epigraphic evidence cannot simply be seen as a proof of the disappearance of the institution itself. And once again, from a methodological point of view, I think it's important. The political realities are only partly mirrored in inscriptions, and we have to be aware of the limits of epigraphic evidence to reconstruct political practice and political culture. Most of the changes which can be documented in the epigraphic practice between the late Hellenistic and the early Imperial periods are not just a matter of fashion or of epigraphic habit, but are symptomatic of the deep changes experienced by civic communities because of the rise of Roman rule. Thank you so much for your attention.